Without further ado, I'd like to welcome you to the first of our 10th year of BrisScience talks. Tonight we have a fantastic panel session for you. So we have a number, not one, but many fantastic speakers from the University of Queensland who are going to talk with you. Tonight, BrisScience is digging deeper as we ask, can Australian soils really feed the world? And to do that, I would like to welcome Professor Neil Menzies, who's the head of School of Agriculture and Food Sciences at the University of Queensland, to host our panel tonight and introduce our panellists. Welcome, Professor Menzies.
Oh, the bright lights. I can't see you at all, but that's okay. I won't be so scared of you, will I? As a university academic, being scared of audiences is the first start to any good talk. That adrenaline rush. Come on stage, guys. Okay, so my name's Neil Menzies. I get the job of trying to keep my panel in order this evening. We're doing this event with Soil Science Australia because this is the International Year of Soil. Now, have a think about our big country, Australia. One of the defining characteristics of our country is its incredible age. And our soils reflect that incredible age. So as our panellists this evening are speaking about what opportunities there are and what difficulties there might be, just keep that age of landscape issue in mind. It defines us as a country, it defines our soils more than any other country. So I'm a soil scientist. Those of you who know me know that I'm a passionate soil scientist. Indeed, the one thing that disappoints me for our organisation this evening is that we don't have little I love soils stickers to give you all. We soil scientists, Gillian, the president of our local Soil Science Society, and I didn't get organised enough to do this. So maybe we'll have to have another soils event where you can get an I love soils sticker. If I could introduce our panel for this evening, starting with the lady on the panel, my much-loved friend Christine Williams, who's Assistant Director-General in the Queensland Department of Science, Information, Technology and Innovation, if I've got it correct. Within that broad department, Christine leads the Science Division, so she looks after the people who give the scientific and technical advice to government agencies to underpin their decision making. And of course, amongst the many scientists that Christine looks after, she looks after most of the government soil scientists. Christine's discipline base is economics, so she studied at Oxford University and at the University of Queensland for her PhD. But I know that over the last 12 months at least, she's been thinking very, very hard and working hard on soil science issues. So she's well versed in Queensland soil science, I think. We will see later, won't we? Sitting next to her in the blue shirt, Peter Stone is a research director at CSIRO. And the blurb reads, and I'm going to read the blurb because it states it so nicely. CSIRO, where agricultural research seeks to increase Australian and global agricultural productivity and food security. Peter has had a diverse history, so trained as a scientist, crop physiologist, I think, but he's worked in farming, in the food industry, consulting, he's done grain marketing, so he's done a broad suite of things. And most recently, his research is focused on quantifying the social and environmental challenges and opportunities associated with Australia's growing gas industry. And of course, there's a hell of a soil component in that one, Peter. And identifying the scale and location of opportunities for developing Northern Australia. And once again, I think that there are a whole lot of soil science questions you could ask him about that. Right at this end, Robert Pekin, if I got the pronunciation right? Yeah. Executive Director of Food Connect Foundation. So the Food Connect Foundation's vision is a world where all Australians can access healthy, fresh, ecologically grown food that is fair to growers and eaters. Robert's a fourth generation organic dairy farmer, and over the last 17 years has been innovating the concept of community-supported agriculture. And finally, at the far side, Phil Mulvey, who's Chief Executive Officer at Environmental and Earth Sciences. Phil is a soil scientist. I can think of no greater accolade, Phil, so up here there's you and I. Phil's scientific passion has been how to bring contaminated land back into use. So rather than just saying, nah, that soil's contaminated, forget about it, it's a disaster area, Phil has worked on how you make that land usable again. They've set themselves a challenge as a company, and this is one hell of it. This is the reach challenge, isn't it? They want to directly or indirectly contribute to rehabilitating 10% of the Earth's degraded land by 2034. More power to you, mate, if you're able to achieve that. So, I'm going to hand over to our panel. Each presenter will be giving you 8 to 10 minutes of talk. I'll stomp my foot on the floor or something to hold you to time. No, I won't do that. You'll all be brief. The idea is that they will give you an insight to how they think about our soils and our food supply, our future sustainability. And then we'll look for questions from the audience. We'll look for debate amongst our panel members.
I should let you know that I'm not a scientist. I flunked out of school in Year 11 and joined the Navy. A wise uncle of mine, I was about to join the priesthood, and a wise uncle of mine took me on a bit of a drive and convinced me that wasn't a really good thing to do. So the next day I joined the Navy. The complete opposite, and have thanked him ever since. So I'm not a scientist. I was born and bred at a dairy farm down in Western Victoria, dry land country, nice sort of arable volcanic soil with a bit of rock on top of the hill. The two volcanoes that my farm existed on, one was 2 million years old and the other one was 40,000 years old. So very, very young soils in comparison to most Australian soils. But I got to really experience what you can actually do with all types of soils, from the top of the hill right down to the cracking clays down the bottom. I had 400 acres and milked about 300 cows. And went from a transition from a conventional farmer that my dad and his father, I suppose, although they probably didn't use as much super and potash and those sorts of things as my dad did. And then when I arrived back at the farm after 10 years as an aircraft engineer, I started to see that there was another story that needed to be explored, or another avenue, another road. You might notice from the Food Connect logo that we have dirt at the top of our logo. This is our fourth. We've been going 10 years, and every time we've invented a logo or a slogan or something or other, Coles and Woolies have copied us. So we thought we're going to put something out there that they will never copy. I don't think we'll ever see Coles and Woolies celebrating those four attributes. But dirt is at the top because all our farmers we all know that soil is the foundation of all health. It's that thin crust that protects Mother Earth, and we get fantastic nutritional food out of that. If it's looked after properly, we become healthy. So it's foundational to us as healthy citizens, and the biodiversity and all of those sorts of things. So just want to point that out at the start. So I think that's why I got invited to speak today. My first experience with the soil scientists, and it's really amazing because when I got back to the dairy farm and started to follow along in Dad's footsteps and learn a few things, I was really blown away by how many times I went to an event and here would be a chemist, basically, at the town hall or the local Perennialic hall or all the halls around would be how to rear your calves, and it was a chemist. How much super to put on, it was a chemist and a company. And we're always surrounded by slogans. And one day I went to a field day with a bunch of other farmers. We just set up the Australian Sustainable Dairy Farmers Managers. And we went to this field day and there was 3 soil scientists there. I've never met a soil scientist. And they were hopping out of their skin. These chemists and these company executives were never hopping out of their skin as much as these 3 soil scientists. They dug a massive hole on this farmer's property, and they couldn't wait to get in there, down below us, and point out every single thing. And I mean, there was 3 of them. One was a female, which was even a rare thing for us as farmers to actually come across a female advising us farmers how to go about things. But it really turned a switch on inside of my head and particularly my body, because I was excited because the first time I was hearing someone talk plain common sense to me and tell me what actually went on underneath, the ground that I walked over, the ground that my cows walked over. All of those things. So it was it was one of those epiphany, I was going to say an epiphanic moment, but it was an epiphany for me. And that was the day I started on this other journey. So it's really great you're going to cover rescuing soils, because I've seen farmers do absolutely amazing things with like soil you would classify as concrete, really. Or solidify to the extent where you'd think nothing could grow again. And farmers, year by year, add an inch to or bit by bit, add layers of topsoil and humus and organic matter, and really tend to that soil and just show that you can do just quite extraordinary things. So I'm really looking forward to Phil speak. So my talk is going to basically cover the food. Not so much in the farming aspect. We've got a lot of farmers. I will cover a little bit of it, but mainly in the rest of the journey, from the paddock right through to us, and how basically Food Connect, and we're seeing this revolution in regional food economies or local food economies, replicate that life, those communities that exist in the soil. And when you study the soil, you see, I don't know whether about 5 years ago, they were talking millions. In a teaspoon of soil is 1 million life forms. Now that's extraordinary when you consider that. And they all have a purpose. They all do something valuable. They have antagonisms, and they all add something to the soil and to the plant, obviously plant life above that. So what we do at Food Connect is basically mimic that life, that community of life that exists in the soil, because it exists in us. We're made up of trillions and trillions of microbes. We're actually the host. We're not really humans. We're just this thing that walks along, and we host all of these microbial and worms and all sorts of amazing things that just inhabit us, like the soil. And what I'm going to talk about is how we replicate that out into our communities, and we have amazing things. Now, we all know that, we don't, a lot of people don't know, because the common mantra out there is we need to double production. I think the Queensland government want to triple production, or triple the economic benefit. We already grow enough food for 11 billion people on the planet. Some people even put it at 14 billion. But there's bucket loads of food out there. So we haven't got a problem with production, albeit we have got some issues with... Can you go to the next slide, please? Although we have got some issues with salinity, profitability, affordability. I'll throw all those things up there. I've only got 5 or so minutes to go. But you can look at those things there. We have got some issues going on the farmer end of things. The scariest one is, because the average age of farmers is up around the 60s, 50% of Australian land owned by farmers will transfer ownership in the next 10 to 15 years. Now that's why the Chinese are over here and a whole bunch of things. That's why you can't blame a farmer who says, yeah, bugger this, my kids aren't coming back, I'm selling. I'm getting out of this because it sucks. So we have got some real issues, but we still have a very high productive capacity. The waste is in distribution. The waste is in the quality of food on a farm that gets thrown out because it's not glossy or glamorous enough, and it's not shaped in the right way to pack in a box to make transport fairer. So there's a whole bunch of issues. So there is plenty of food being grown. Now, can I get to the next slide, please, if you had a look at that one there? So this is, in a nutshell, what we focus on at Food Connect. This is one of the, this is a real community, and it's based on Brisbane. You can replicate this anywhere around the world, and a lot of people are using this sort of zoning idea. So the simple premise is that zone 1 is your backyard. So if you want a food system which is has a net positive impact on the climate. So in other words, it sequesters carbon dioxide, and it has all of the other attributes that you would call a sustainable food system. You would start with zone 1, that's your backyard. So it's very simple stuff. That's where you grow your herbs, your cherry tomatoes, those leafy salads, so your open-hearted lettuces, those sorts of things. They're the sort of things you grow in your backyard. And the idea I've got is, and in your down the road around your block, so you could walk there. That's the idea there. Zone 1 is where you would ride to get your food. So there you're sort of in your peri-urban areas, or the empty blocks, what I call nook and cranny farms in the suburbs, where people have found a couple of empty blocks, or it's a community garden, those sorts of things, and they're growing some of the more productive crops, and you're grabbing them from there. Zone 3 is, and you can see, and you can adjust this for whatever you like. I mean, Brisbane is so fortunate because we've got about 9 microclimates from Stanthorpe to Bundaberg that are so diverse and so different from each other. You couldn't do this in Melbourne, you couldn't do this in Sydney, mainly because we've got Stanthorpe, or the granite belt, and then the Trap Rock Plains behind the granite belt, where we've got sheep and just really great country for grazing sheep and for growing wines and things like that. The granite belt is an amazing countryside. The temperatures up there are extraordinary, and we can get a lot of our summer vegetables, cauliflowers, cabbages, lettuces, all of those things that you can't normally grow down here in the flatland. And then we've got the northern districts, the northern New South Wales as well. So we've got 9 microclimates, very, very different from each other, that spoils Brisbane. So when you look at this zoning thing, or you're simply looking at what is wet, really wet, so you don't want to transport water. And generally, if you're transporting water, if it's got a lot of water in it, it's also highly perishable. So you want to eat that pretty quick to get the nutritional value. And then you go right out, you just keep going out through your, I'll just get my little thingo up here. You're talking about in zone 2, your larger crops, your heavy, some of your milk might come from there. So same thing if you consider milk, wet, it's wet. Whereas cheese, hard cheeses, not soft cheeses, hard cheeses, butters, those sorts of things are dry. They can come from further out. Same thing with meats. If your meats are being cured out 5 hours away and sent in dried, cured, where you only need small quantities to add, sufficient flavour to your meals, it comes from further out. Whereas your red meats, those sorts of things that you're going to eat fresh, they're from further in. It's really thinking about common sense. Spuds, obviously quite a dry crop, not very perishable, can last 2 to 3 weeks or 4 weeks in a cool climate. Corn, heavy feeder, you need not large acreage, but you need reasonable acreage. So it's pretty common sense, this zone mapping. Now the amazing thing about this sort of stuff here, and I've got a big thing there saying eyes per acre, when you've got eyes per acre, you have so much more productivity and so we're talking about addressing some of the issues with the things that are coming down the chute in terms of soil erosion, climate change impacts, or impacts from climate change or a changing climate, impacts from older farmers, impacts from drought, other things that are going to be happening. When you centralise your cities around, and this is more of a hub thing, then you have much more productivity. So we've got some farmers where the average yield for, say, a lychee crop is around about 40 to 50 kilos or 50 to 60 kilos per tree. He's getting 3,000 kilos per tree. Avocado crops, we've got all our avocado farmers are getting up around the 500 kilos per tree, where the average is around about 70 kilos per tree for a normal farmer, for a normal conventional farmer out there. With whatever it is, 20, 30, 40 acres, 50 acres. The same thing with horticulture. A salad farmer who's growing, say, just this strip here, he can grow way more lettuce, and we could just talk about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He will grow way more lettuce than you would ever think possible, because he'll be planting every second day and harvesting the leaves. And you'll get way more productivity than a farmer out at Gatton, those sorts of places. So when you have this more eyes per acre, you have much more care for the earth, much more intense interest in the soil, much more diversity, much more biodiversity as a result. And the benefits are just overlaid on top of each other. Then when you start to talk about us as the participants in the food chain, we have much more power as consumers to dictate what we want because we're closer to the farmer. We can actually have a conversation with the farmer. We can say, listen, I'm prepared to let you experiment with some of these varieties that have gone extinct or aren't used anymore. We all know the number of varieties of fruit and vegetables that we consume these days is only about 2% of what was being grown in the early 1900s. So we can ask farmers to grow that. We'll accept him trialling it on us because we know him. We'll actually invest in his farm. We've got subscribers who have actually built B&Bs on farmers' farms to add to their cash flow situation and to ease the capital burden of trying to find a block of land to build a B&B on. We've got plenty of farmers who do that. So you see all sorts of amazing financial interactions, obviously spirit interactions, community interactions. Farmers are well known to be reasonably narrow-minded, bigoted, racist, homophobic, all of those sorts of things. I was a dairy farmer. I mean, I was Tony Abbott 15 years ago. I'm completely a changed person. We employ at Food Connect transsexual, quite a few gay couples. I always bring farmers in. We'll take them to a restaurant where there's a gay couple there for them to experience a real human. It's just another human. For them to open their minds up. And this is really important because farmers are killing themselves. The amount of suicide, dairy farmers in Queensland is shocking. But it's 3 to 4 farmers suiciding per week because they're bloody lonely. Because they've got a view of the world that hasn't been opened up by us as consumers. So it's a really important interaction if we want to have great food and a healthy planet and healthy communities and no wars and all of these sorts of things. So food is the great equaliser. It's a great touch point. And that's at Food Connect we focus on food just being that touch point for people to go on their own journey, whether it be putting some solar on the roof or putting a water tank in, or growing something in their own backyard, or sharing baby food stories with their neighbour, because we have a unique city cousin distribution scheme. It's not a shop. It's a place where you go and have a cup of tea with the person who's there, and they'll talk to you about the farmer because they've met the farmer. How much time have I got left? No? Zero, right. Okay. So I think I've covered a fair few things there. I'll just go right to the last page. So what are some of the things? And this isn't backward stuff. This isn't going back to the 60s. These farmers are using technology. Where are we? Oh, food hubs. What's the next one? Sorry. We are a social enterprise. Okay, well, next one. Cool. Okay, so this isn't about, if it wasn't for the internet, if it wasn't for online ordering, this revolution wouldn't be possible. Farmers wouldn't be able, or farmers' daughters, because they don't generally tend to tweet, wouldn't be able to take a picture of broccoli crop and say, my dad's just out there planting broccoli and you're going to be eating it in 8 weeks' time or 9 weeks' time. I'm putting that up on a website and then we Facebook it or Twitter it and people get really excited and they start to own that farmer. That farmer's my farm. He's my farmer. Don't you bloody touch him, CSG mine, or miners. Don't you interfere with him, Coke, who are trying to drain all the water to sell wherever. That's happening down in the fire burden districts just north of Melbourne. They moved in after the fires. Coke moved in, drained the water, put in bottled water. Now, I hope none of you drink bottled water. It's one of the most disgusting things on the planet. Can't believe it. Anyway, so we're talking about new economies. We're talking about farmers using electric fences. We're talking about farmers really investing in knowledge, in brain, in how do I work with these soil communities, with these amazing, build the nutrient capacity of these foods, how do I sell direct, how do I value add, how do I grow more crops, how do I understand a butterfly to a bird, to a small critter running through their paddock, and how they all complement to the whole ecology of their farm. This is really fascinating stuff. It's challenging stuff, and we're just replicating that out in communities where we see critters running around the streets of Brisbane and saying, oi mate, what's your life about? Do you want to join something that is really going to be transformative for yourself? Do you want to consume less sugar? and there's so many data with what small farmers will do in lowering obesity, decreasing the health budget or decreasing health. Or, you know, one of our sayings is we should be paying our farmers the same amount you'd pay a heart surgeon, because that's exactly what they're doing. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me along. I've been asked to talk about the role of Australia in food security for us and for others. And I'll try to do that pretty quickly before shifting to the bigger question of global food security. Now, according to the Food and Agriculture Organisation of the United Nations, food security exists when all people at all times have the physical, social and economic access to sufficient, safe and nutritious food to meet their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. Now, there's quite a bit there, more than I can cover in 5 or 10 minutes. So I'm going to focus largely on the sufficiency part of food security, recognising that nutrition and food preferences are really important components of the way that we eat. Australia currently has a population of 24 million people, and we grow food sufficient to feed 80 million people. So even when our population reaches a predicted 42 million people in 2050, we'll have at least twice as much food as we can eat, just based on current levels of production. And if productivity continues to grow at its historic levels of 2% per annum, in 2050 we'll still be growing 3 to 4 times more food than we in Australia can eat. A sizable proportion of our population is making inroads into that food production, that excess tucker. 14 million Australians, about 60% of us, are overweight. 5 million, or 20% of our population, is technically obese. Australians aren't short of food now, and the evidence suggests they won't be in the future. Now, nutrition is not the same as sufficiency. 20% of Australia's population, despite that excess of food, is not properly nourished. And that's a particular challenge in remote communities. Now, if we get into difficulty in terms of sufficiency of production, we actually have plenty of land and water in reserve. Recent work by CSIRO has shown that Northern Australia has about 16 million hectares of soil that is at least moderately suitable for intensive agriculture. Bringing that into production would increase the productive cultivated area of Australian soil by 50%. Now, that soil won't grow much unless it's irrigated. And we've shown that if attempts were made to capture all of Northern Australia's water for agriculture, it would be possible to irrigate about 10% of that land. So the 1.5 million hectares of new irrigation land that would create would increase Australia's irrigated area by about 75%. So that currently untapped potential, if you were to convert it into growing stuff and calories, would be enough to feed 7.5 million people. That's 4 Perths. It's 90% of the populations of Melbourne and Sydney combined. And wait for it, it's enough to feed 65 days of the population growth in Asia. Now, actually doing that, having an extra 1.5 million hectares in Northern Australia of irrigated land, would require large investment and a big range of social, economic and environmental impacts that we as a society would need to think about. So look, we can grow lots of food, and because we're rich, we can actually afford to buy it from just about anybody that will sell it. According to the International Monetary Fund, Australia is in the top 14, it's actually number 14, in terms of being the richest nation on earth, GDP per capita. And we'll still, according to all predictions, be in the top 20 by 2050. So to be blunt, if there was a bidding war, we'd be able to outbid 94% of the world's population if it came to having to buy our food. Now, not everybody's a big fan of the International Monetary Fund, so I'll give you another global point of reference. Australia is number 8 on the Big Mac index of food affordability. So, look, my message is really Australia itself is food secure. But what about the rest of the world? In the last 50 years, global population has doubled, while food supply has trebled. In the last 20 years, the proportion of undernourished people has declined from 25% of the world's population to 15% of the world's population. So it's a really impressive progress. Despite that, about 1 in 8 people, a bit over 800 million, remain chronically undernourished. So what are the prospects for feeding them? Look, as Rob mentioned, actually the food for everybody on the planet already exists. It's just that it tends to go to the highest bidder rather than to the most needy. I'm not actually qualified to talk about global equality in economy and food distribution, so I'm really going to focus on the challenge of continuing to meet global food demand in pure volume terms. So what's the scale of that challenge? Well, there's people out there who might be collectors of obscure units of measurement, so I've got one for you. The world currently demands 7 femtokilocalories of food each year. That's 7 times 10 to the 15 kilocalories of food required by the population of 7 odd billion. Now, between now and 2050, that requirement is likely to increase by about 50%, or twice the rate of our population growth. So food demand rises faster than population does, partly because we're tending to eat more, but also because we're tending to eat foods that have a greater intensity of input requirement, like meat and dairy. So, will we be able to increase food production by 50% over the next 35 years? And if so, what are the most likely pathways? Well, the answer to the first question is likely to be yes. There's actually no compelling evidence to suggest that we can't meet the challenge of rising food demand. In fact, we've done it before. In the 40 years to 2000, food production globally increased 150%. In doing so, the area of land occupied by agriculture increased 11%. The challenge before us is proportionally 1/3 of that size. So if we accept that we will be able to meet rising global food demand, I guess the next question is how? This has actually been examined pretty closely by some of my colleagues who offer the following response. Meeting increased demand for food will require a journey down 3 major pathways. Reducing the demand for food production, increasing the supply of food production, and avoiding loss of current and future potential for production. So I'll just walk you through those. Expert opinion suggests that together, those 3 pathways can enable the food needs of 2050 to be met. So let's just look at each in detail. So, reducing demand for food production. That can probably get us 20% of the way to meeting the food needs of 2050. And that can occur by phenomena such as reducing waste. Rob mentioned waste. In the value chain, it's typically 20 to 40% of production. We could increase the efficiency of agricultural production by balancing the livestock component of future diets. Livestock systems are 2 to 100 times less efficient at creating calories for human consumption than cereal-based systems. And 1/3 of the world's cereal production is currently fed to livestock. Developing biofuels that consume less food could help. 15% of global maize, sugar and vegetable oil are currently used to make biofuel. And reducing overconsumption of food by the world's 1.4 billion overfed people could help to reduce demand for food production. So there's a number of prospects for increasing food supply by reducing food demand. The second one, increasing supply of food production. that can probably get us about 50% of the way to meeting global food demand in 2050. There's a number of ways we can do that. We could expand the land footprint of agriculture. Incredibly, there's about 1.4 billion hectares of good or prime land that isn't currently being cultivated. And we probably don't really have an appetite for clearing 1.4 billion hectares of land, but if it was required, it's possible. We could increase the efficiency of water use. 70% of the world's fresh water is currently used in agricultural production. Probably not a huge appetite for increasing that to a large degree, and so it's likely that increasing the efficiency with which you use the water currently used in agriculture could be useful. Aquaculture currently supplies 15% of the protein consumed by humans. When land-based, it doesn't tend to compete with the same resources as agriculture does. There's big opportunities in closing gaps between actual and potential yields. 10 to 20% yield increases are possible in the developed world. 60 to 80% increases are possible in the developing world, simply by better use of existing technologies. So there's a number of prospects for increasing food supply by increasing production and production options. And finally, we could avoid losing current and future potential for production, which would get us the last 30% of the way to meeting 2050's food needs. Avoiding losing current potential future production could happen by a couple of ways: maintaining existing levels of biosecurity and food safety, avoiding land and water degradation through processes such as erosion, salinity, acidification, etc. And also minimising climate change and maximising the rate at which adaptation to it occurs. So protecting the production assets that we've already got will have an important part in meeting global food demand. So really, there's plenty of agricultural rabbits waiting to be pulled out of hats. The three major pathways that I've outlined ought to be enough to enable us to increase food production by 50% within the next 35 years. It's clear there's not a single silver bullet that's going to work there. It's really a bunch of silver shotgun pellets. We have done it before, and we ought to be able to do it again. So I really have three main points. Australia actually has plenty of food now, and will for the next 40 years. Though we need to pay attention to nutrition and its distribution in our community. My second point is that many in other nations lack the capacity to grow and distribute food in the way that Australia does. So we'll continue to play a key role in producing food for consumption in other countries. And finally, protecting the assets needed to grow our food is obviously an important ongoing activity. So, thank you.
Well, I don't know why I've managed to come as the economist after more interesting people, but I'll try not to be too dry. Food security is obviously one of the world's wicked problems. How do we actually ensure we have food security and still live the lives we want to live? So lots of questions have been raised in terms of some people eat too much. It wasn't quite as tight as it is at this point. So how do we actually manage to continue to feed everybody without actually harming the environment in which we're living? And some of those points have been touched on. So Australia has, and Queensland, got a really important role to play in the solution to food security. Peter says we can do it. We are a traditional agricultural producer with ambitions to increase agricultural output to meet the growing international demand for our products. And the demand for our products is growing rapidly. Particularly the Chinese diet is changing rapidly, with more beef, more sugar, more dairy, the things that take up more of our resources, and less of the traditional starches and grains. So as the East becomes more West in its diet, we're actually going to be using more and more of our resources to grow that food. And I would disagree about agricultural productivity. My facts say that it has been growing about 2.5% per annum over the last half of the 20th century, but it's really dropped back over the last 10 to 15 years to around about just under 1%. So trying to keep that productivity growth is very important. But I'm here to talk about the year of the soil, so I'm actually going to talk about soils a little bit and how important they are. I was asked to come along by two of my soil scientists, and at a weak moment I obviously agreed to come along and talk and representing the soil scientists here. So I want to focus on some of the challenges which face us in managing our soil resources to meet future food security needs. Ultimately, to have food security, we need to look after our scarce resource, our soils. So food security, you can read soil security, and also water security is another aspect of it. They don't all go hand in hand. Australia's soils are ancient and fragile, and they need to be nurtured and well managed to be able to provide the ongoing service of supporting agriculture. But nourishing the soil, adding more fertiliser, to be more productive, can also have very adverse impacts on other environmental assets, such as water quality. Water overstocking can actually lead to loss of soil through erosion, which in itself also adds to water quality issues. So how do we deal with that? The reef is a big issue, obviously. It's one of the things, every day there's something there about the Great Barrier Reef and how we put it under pressure, and how you can argue all the different things that can be, whether it's mining that's causing the pressure or agriculture. It is the pressure of development on that area is causing soils problems. So it comes back to soils. If we don't manage our soils properly, then we don't manage the water quality and therefore the beautiful environment asset of the reef. I guess the other thing, Queensland's agricultural lands are also really subject to great competition from alternate uses, other industries, such as mining and gas. The development in rural areas is a really hot issue in terms of how do we best allocate the land, whether it should be for putting in coal mines, and if you put a coal mine in, what's going to happen to the soil that's on the top? Is it gone forever? Coal seam gas, urban development, extending into the peri-urban and areas that were traditionally horticultural areas around the cities, and areas that used to be very productive rural landscapes, but we're stretching out there. So in some sense we have a situation of the tragedy of the commons, which is a well-known economics idea that can apply to our soils. So the tragedy of the commons asserts that individuals acting independently and rationally according to each self-interest can behave contrary to the best interests of the group as a whole by depleting some common resource. So the original context was herders in medieval UK or England, sharing a common parcel of land of which they were all entitled to have their cows and sheep. So for each individual animal using the common, everybody would get a return. So you had tried to maximise the number of animals you had on there, and everyone would gain privately from doing that. So the herder could receive benefits, but the group as a whole is going to have a problem because you're going to have an overutilised common with soil degradation and ultimately not being productive at all. So that's exactly what we have with our soils. We have a situation where if we don't manage them properly and look after them from a sort of society point of view, how can we trust individuals to do the right thing? I don't think we all can be quite as ethical. I'm not sure that all the farmers are as ethical to actually make sure that they are even improving the land for the future generations. So I guess there's two questions. How do we best decide what is the best use of our soil, and how best to manage them if it is the best uses for agriculture? I guess the easiest question is how to manage the soil for agriculture. It gets away from these thorny issues of whether or not we should have mines or urban areas on the land. But even that one has a time dimension. How are we actually managing them? Are we managing them for us now or our current generation, or for future generations? Obviously it makes a huge difference as to what you do. Australia's got a long history of farming families where the land has been managed to ensure it can support future generations. But if we have an increasing proportion of land being managed by corporations, can we be sure that they're going to manage that land in a way that protects the value for future generations? So are we interested in what we do now, on maximising now, or are we going to be looking after it into the future? In short, where is that balance point between food security and environmental sustainability? And it comes down to what's the social value of soil, or the public value of soil, versus the private value to the individual, whether that's a rural producer, a housing developer, or a mining company. And trying to work that out, what is the best use of a particular piece of land, is really complex. What is the timescale you use? What prices you use to value the outputs of the land? What will the price of meat be in the future? Grain? What's the price of water, which is obviously another important resource? What's the price of housing? So, I mean, an economist wants to know all these things so we can actually work it out and do an optimization plan and come up with a way forward. We're very idealistic sometimes in how we do things. So you can't actually do that. So, and the other thing is food security goes far beyond just the price they get for the food. If we don't have food security, we're going to have populations not having adequate nutrition to be able to survive, and that has that human ethical issue associated with it as well. So it's a really difficult, complex and difficult stuff, and it involves many judgments and assumptions. So how do you actually go about managing the best use of soil? Well, I guess one simple way of doing it is to better understand what we have in terms of soils, so we can assess when there are alternative land uses, whether the soil is particularly worthy of preservation, and preservation for agriculture, for example. So obviously in Queensland we've taken that approach. We need to know more about the soils we have and work out which ones should be looked after for the point of view of future use for agriculture. And that's been done through the agricultural land audit and strategic cropping land. So my scientists have been out there doing really good work, mapping the soils and working out which are the best soils we should be looking at to keep for future generations and keep for agriculture. In fact, one of the things that's talking about interesting statistics, I'll throw one out there. We launched the Soils Globe in December last year, and the Soils Globe is on like a Google Earth type approach of looking at what soils we have in Queensland, and we've had 500,000 hits already. So some people out there are interested in soils. So I was going to talk more, but I want to leave time for our man who's got to challenge everything. So I'm just going to throw out there, so how do we actually manage all these externalities? Because that's what economists call them. When we actually do something to get our own private benefit that has an adverse impact on somebody else, as an externality. Producers applying too much fertiliser, applying it at the wrong time, using too much water. The consequences are felt by the environment, and that things like the crown of thorns events come from having too much fertiliser going on or putting it on at the wrong time. So if I had time, I'd be talking a lot more about how we actually go about managing these externalities, but we might deal with that in questions.
Who's ever jumped in a puddle as a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old? Who recalls going bang, 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 bang all the way down the street or across the farm or across the paddock? Do you know that's your first soil diagnostic tool? A puddle. Because the puddle tells you about the soil. It tells you the rate at which water penetrates, how long it lasts. If it's murky, it tells you about the soil chemistry. Oh, there's a lot of science in a puddle. Stokes' law and all kinds of things I won't tell you about. But all you need to know that if that's still murky 8 hours after the rain, you've got a problem soil. That's all you need to know. You want the puddle to go away fast, looking like that. Who here has a veggie garden? Come on. Beautiful. Who here, apart from a pH kit, which next to my hat, has tested their soil? Oh dear, I'll teach you how not to. Brilliant that you do. pH is useful, and useful for farms. That's my puddle. It's a cup of water with a clog of soil thrown in it to tell me about my soil. because you can do all the chemistry you need for the backyard veggie patch by your eyes, by your nose, by your taste, providing you've checked out the contaminated soil first. Because to know about good soil, you all know it should be friable, it should be rich in organic matter, it should look and smell earthy. And the yields are good. There's no yellow on the leaves, and the water gets away, and it settles quickly. What more do we need to know? That's production. Problem is, you need to do it without all the labour you put in. We need to get the top of that ped is dark. The lower part of it is brown. We need to get the organic matter to penetrate. I'd like to talk about why our soil's different. Ancient and fragile was your words. And yes, it's right, ancient and fragile. A brief lesson in geology from a soil scientist. It's very simple. This here is a geological plate. And when plates hit each other, they go bang. And along comes the clouds and they rise up. And what do they have to do? They rain. And they drop down lots of rain, and it's very steep. So they flow very rapidly and they erode. And down in the flats, because the flats change very rapidly, you drop down silt and sand. Now, what that actually means is mostly because of mountain you got more rain, because of silt you got ground up rock that's fresh and full of the nutrient you need. Because of the rain you've got better production of vegetative matter and therefore you get more organic matter. And on top of that, for good measure, the good Lord sent along glaciation to ground up that there rock and blow it back across the countryside, if you happen to be an American. So that means you've got lovely ground up rock for everyone to grow on with high organic matter. Now let's look at Australia. Out there is New Zealand, and there is New Guinea, and over here is the edge of East Timor, and down there's Macquarie Island. Well, they all got volcanoes. Well, they all got uplifts. Why? Because that's the edge of Australia's plate. So we were blessed with having a land like the rest of us. It was pretty lethargic. Let it all go by. So what's happened? Up pops the mountain range a long way from Australia. And along comes the wind, and off goes the wind. There's nothing to throw it up. So what happens? The sun goes, and those rock minerals are in place and they weather. And when they weather, they lose their nutrient. And they become old. And they become clays that aren't very reactive. And less rain means less organic matter opportunities to build up. So in simple terms, America mostly and the EU mostly started at 8 to 12% organic matter, with a measure of, say, if you put it 0 to 50, and 50 being exceptionally reactive fertile clay, they are sort of 40s. It's called milliequivalents per 100 gram. You don't need the units. In Australia, blessed little Australia, Australia is so blessed with good soil, we mine them because they're so old. They're called alumina and bauxite and even in some cases pisolytic iron ore. That's because they're so old. So the organic matter in Australia started at 2%. Now, after 40 years of rotational tillage, we started to drop. And now, 80 years into rotational tillage, we're at 0.8%. 0.8%. It's stabilised in the US and Europe from 12 to about 6%. And they're whinging at 6%. So Australia, we're now mining, thank you Robert, lumps of concrete. Sorry, did I say mining? No. Agriculture, isn't it? We've mined our organic matter. We've not put it back. We're at the point now that we are actually... Where did I put my little turner? Over there. We're at the point now where we are fully degrading all agricultural land. That's the ancient landscape we've got. So, these are my little talks to me. In case I forgot to talk about organic matter, I'll keep putting this up because I don't want you to forget organic matter, because every farmer should be a gardener, because every gardener knows the power of organic matter. Who watches the gardening show on the ABC? There's a soil scientist who gets in there. But there's a whole heap of presenters that keep saying, organic matter, and they're right. Now, my devil's advocate role is to address some of these issues, but I'll always come back to organic matter. So I want to say our system is wrong. Not that I'm saying Rob's system's 100% right, but I'm saying historically our system has been wrong. The Aboriginals had a very good system, and if you've read Professor Gamage's fantastic book, they managed this landscape. And they managed it to optimise their yield during droughts. They also managed their population. Their women ensured that they had a limited number of offspring. It was all carefully managed. I suggest you read Professor Gamage's book. We ceased to manage our landscape. So we had a system that came in with the European system of a rotational system, which worked in Europe. High organic matter. Worked quite well. It was stock, grain, legume, spell. And that went up until the 60s until we found us soil scientists things called chemistry and fertilisers, and we went a bit nuts. And all the extension officers went out and said, let's put lots of fertiliser out, and we did that, and it got acid, and we thought, no, we can fix that, we'll put lime on. And suddenly it got quite expensive because when you drop the pH, you change the chemistry of organic matter, and it ceases to work as a glue, and you lose the organic glue that holds your clods together. They blow, they erode, they cease to be fluffy, and we get big floods, and we get long droughts because we can't hold our soil moisture content anymore. So that system went through till about the 80s, and then in the 80s we stopped tillage and went for controlled traffic, but we were still yet to fully learn about how to manage organic matter. So we had the wrong system. So the situation is, the farmers want to do the right thing, but knowing what's the right thing and how to do it is a different matter. So the mixed family farm is actually, in many places, where you're not on a sandy soil or a swelling, forgiving black clay on recent basalt, you have a problem. We have these lovely little things here that populate the landscape. They're great for our wealth. That is a sheepfoot's roller. That's a sheep. You got the picture, huh? That's how we compact our car parks, is we get a sheepfoot's roller out and compact it. So if you go through an agricultural system on a light clay to heavy clay soil and you rotate sheep on it, you drop next year's wheat yield by 60%. Worth noting. The other problem that comes out from it, once your organic matter goes, the salinity and sodicity issues that are in our landscape can work. So the glue that held them together is gone. We didn't invent salicity 30 years ago, or sodicity. Our landscape is ancient. It's riddled with it. Nature worked out how to stop it. We've taken the glue away. What happens when we take the glue away? A standard erosional situation. Get rid of the slopes, put them on the flats, increase the flats 2 or 3 metres in elevation, get our slopes down. Along the way, we have a lot going to rivers and we have other problems. You read all the explorers' diaries, not a single river had sediment in it. The greatest threat to food production. What is it in Australia? I've just shown you that almost all agricultural land is degraded. So surely the greatest threat is current farming practices. Now, you're not going to like that. Mining is about 2% of degraded land in Australia. Current land practices are not sustainable. Urbanisation, I'd like to pick up very much with Christine's comment and really push it along a bit, is there's two problems with urbanisation. One is the current community, with a lot of help from Robert, is about to change, but the current community is disconnected with how their food is made. So when they hear about nutrient problems in the reef, they don't blame themselves. The next thing is expansion. I would say at least a third of the audience here has made money out of owning their house here in Brisbane or the region. And the reason they've done that is the increased pressure of people. And the increase of pressure of people has pushed those people out onto some of our best agricultural land. And if you drive through Europe, you drive through built up and bang, you come out and you're in a full wheat field. It's absolutely strongly demarked. Australia, we go out through people's super funds where they're holding it to wait to see what happens. We go out to the ferals, having all kinds of issues going on. And we finally get out after 50 miles. We get out further and we go, oh, we're back on agricultural land. Expansion. Urban expansion is a major problem. I'm sorry, Peter, I took parts of your slot not knowing you weren't going to talk. So this is the slide he spoke to very carefully about the different layers. I would argue that we're actually in the middle of a major decline in agricultural production. It's come down from 2.5% to 1% and it's falling and will continue in Australia further. The Punjab is a major part of the Green Revolution of the 60s and 70s. It depended on pumped groundwater. That groundwater's got 5 years to go. India will go from being sustainable to having to import 60% of its rice crop. China has gone the same way. They've destroyed a lot of their land and it's on Laos. They cut the trees down, it's blown away. The Yellow River was not the Yellow River for a particular reason, but it happened to be yellow because it carried so much sediment and it's even more yellow now. We have a problem. This is a slide that Peter, I thought, was going to put up, but didn't, so my apologies. In both, for the first one I've actually referenced you carefully down the bottom, but the second one I haven't. So it is your slide, you just didn't use it. I'd like to point out that the potential yield of particular areas depends on its rainfall, effectively. So the best farmers, and I work with quite a few and the best in fixing degraded land, achieve quite close to the potential. The average farmer on a good year has this yield gap. This is the CSIRO's figure, so my apologies, I have adopted it, but I've altered it because they didn't tell you it was about a good year. On a dry year, which in Australia we have 2 good years and 10, we have 6 dry years and we have 2 droughts. But in a dry year now, with the land degradation I'm just talking about, the best farmer's still holding it, the average farmer's not. In a drought year, the difference between the best is the best make money during the drought. The best go into the drought and carry a crop all the way in the 2-year drought and come out of it fast. However, the average farmer, now average means roughly 60% of the population if you want to look at a bell curve, and that's the case. In Australia, 40% of farms, family-owned farms now, are currently under threat for repossession. 20% are directly under threat, and the banks aren't closing on them because that'll drop the land price and put the other 20% in threat and encourage overseas people to buy up big. So it is a problem. So there's a willingness to actually do something about it. I'm a soil scientist, I've got to have a pit, I mean really. So there's a pit, with me in it of course. You know, if you've got 6 pedologists in the soil pit, you get 6 different definitions of description of what the soil is. Anyway, we won't go there. So the absence of systems management is a major issue. We've addressed it briefly, but I want to talk about the issue of not a tragedy of the commons. And the reason why I don't think it's a tragedy of the commons, because the tragedy of commons is based on land commonly held. What we do with farming and mining, and they'll hate this, is we make the liabilities commonly held. We socialise the liabilities. And what is the liabilities? It's destroyed river systems. It's destroyed ecosystems. It's destroyed reef, if you like. I know that's hard, but the mine industry hasn't been very successful in restoring their system either. The rehab of mines, 1 or 2 have been done to get back to production, they're showcases. The rest have not occurred. So the mine industry, I would say the agriculture industry is no different to the mine industry in that they're socialising their liabilities. I want you to think about that before you throw bricks at me. Effectively, farms are diffuse pollution sources, and the EPAs and the community are yet to address what that means. And this requires a fair degree of government intervention. It's done it very well once before. It's called acid sulphate soil. As a community, we learnt to manage the externalities of mining, of agricultural land and acid sulphate soil. So it'd be nice to see it again. So what we're talking about is a system management that needs to be applied and applied to many marginal farms. But do you know what? You can't be green if you're in the red. So how do we fix this problem? We've got 40% of the farms potentially in the red and not being able to address the issues that need to be done to make them green. Do farmers have a duty of care to the environment or just the consumer? Question. Free advice. Robert, in one of his slides, which he didn't get to put up, so nothing worse than being a devil's advocate when they haven't presented all their stuff. So anyway, I'll have to run with this one. But free advice that Robert was referring to, that the extension officers and the role of Department of Ags to give and support farm communities is important to go ahead. I disagree. I think free advice with no accountability, which is what an agricultural extension officer is, or vested accountability, which is all those chemists trying to sell something, and never get soil testing done by a fertiliser company, because they're going to tell you one thing: you need more fertiliser. Surprise, surprise. They're not going to say cut back. They might say change it. The same, you're going to buy a particular chemical and you go and get the free advice from the agronomist associated with the company. What are they going to tell you? Don't use that chemical, use this one, it's more expensive. No, they didn't mean that, it's going to work better. So the issue is, if you want good advice, you should learn to pay for it. And the department of, because then you value it, and then the person who gives it to you has a professional indemnity to ensure it's the best. The other issue is the Department of Ag, I think they have a major role, but not an extension role. Research on long-term issues is really important, and to benchmark what is the best case and how to get there. Most farmers pay their accountants more than their business advisor. That is to say, their farm advisor. Isn't that appalling? From a soil scientist perspective, I know most farmers who have never actually dug in their own soil except when someone comes out to test. I tell them, I want you at every season, every paddock, digging a pit, I want you to follow that movement of that organic matter down. Farmers are business. They need to go broke. They need all those things that happen to businesses. It's not a lifestyle. Lifestyle's killing our environment. I disagree with Tony in certain aspects, but in one aspect I like that particular quote, but not in the way he used it, so I'll put ahead of it that I don't want to use in the same context, but actually I don't believe farming should be a lifestyle. 60% of all businesses go bankrupt within the first 12 months. Why do we let a bankrupt farmer go on and on and on, destroying the landscape? You're not going to like me for that one either. My wife made me wear this badge today, which has got rubbish on it. She said, Phil, you talk rubbish, you better inoculate them to let them know that you're talking rubbish. So make sure you wear it to make sure you bring it up. But I see it as rubbish is actually fertiliser, so I think it's a very good thing for a soil scientist to wear. So I was actually complimented. She tries to insult me, but never quite works. Selling the farm. Selling the farm not to the Chinese, or the Japanese, by the way, the English are the greatest landowners here of Australian foreigners on the farm, selling the farm to exactly what Rob said, to the city people, because they're the ones who will get you a better price with the duopoly. They're the ones who you'll be able to cut through and buy direct and get better quality food. So we've got to learn to sell the farm as a marketing exercise to people to buy it. But how do we cost externalities when we only have a duopoly to go through? How can you actually say, Rob, I can guarantee that our farm will not be doing this? And at the moment, we need to redefine what organic is. Though organic food sells well, the concept of environmental externalities is not built into organic. Production from urban soil. Who knows about Cuba? Does anyone know the great story of Cuba? It's the most amazing story. And for those of you who haven't heard it, I'll tell you. And for those who have, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to bore you a bit, and you probably know more than I do. The Cold War finished. Cuba was heavily subsidised by Russia. All its food, except for a small bit grew itself, came from Russia, and in return they sent sugar back. Now all they could produce, and all they set up was produce, was sugar. The Cold War ended, literally, with a wall falling over. And Russia said, we can't afford to support you anymore. Cuba had one growing season to feed its people because there was an embargo on it by the US. One growing season with almost 90% of their production put to sugar. How do they do it? They did it, centralised government's handy, but they did it, but said, all vacant land in the urban area, all parks, all backyards, you will all produce food. We will give you the seed. And we will work out what will grow where. But they did it. And they actually support their entire population now from what's known as urban food. Now, there is a movement, and it's growing quite well at the moment, to increase the urban production. But the extent that they did it is just phenomenal. And there are contamination issues to consider. Please wash all your root crops. Lead does not get past the skin. Please wash them before you eat it. However, that's what they did. So, just to make sure I don't forget to tell you about organic matter, I want to tell you again about organic matter before I close off. And whilst you're thinking about questions to ask, I'm going to ask you to remember more organic matter, because that is the answer to degraded soil. If you want to lock up and stop lead penetrating to you, use organic matter. If you want to fix mining land, work out how to use organic matter. If you want to fix pH of 2, producing vast amounts of acid, and you've got a big scald on your property, take the tea tree, chop it, lay it down, put thistles, anything else, let it build up, stops the scald, stops the sun sucking the acid to the surface, you get colonisers coming in. With a couple of years, you've actually got a topsoil. Organic matter saves our soil. Organic matter is where farmers are now going. And by the way, in case I forget, don't forget organic matter.
Let's start with the panel while you guys are writing some questions. Phil, one of the things that you've just implied for us is that if we put more organic matter into our soils, we can improve them. And that's a concept I have no problems with. The problem I have is, where does the organic matter come from?
You need about 5 years to lift from 0.8% to about 2%. We've done it both on the sugar lands, and we've also done it on farms down west of the Newell in New South Wales. We've kept stock off. And we've done a very controlled rotational system even during the droughts. It is possible to do it, but you have to ensure that the farm is disciplined and that you stay to the rotational system very, very carefully. And just to follow up with a bit of soil science, you can't introduce organic matter to go from litter to the soil without nitrogen. So you need a nitrogen rotation system without phosphate and without sulphur. So to each you have to add a little bit to make sure you get the ratios necessary, or introduce a cropping system that does it. So that does mean that in the first 2 or 3 years your production may be down, But the following years you pick it up, and you also pick it up if a drought hits within 2 years of the system. So it is possible to do, but it requires absolute dedication to the task.
And I assume a very high level of quality of management. So once again, we come to how good are the farmers who might be doing this?
Look, this is why I talked about systems management and the environment as part of the system, and the farm and the social setting that the farmers place upon the system. So we are working with farmers on the concept of not just 5-year, but 10 and 20-year plans, including succession within them. So it's a matter of creating a plan with the goal being to improve the productivity of the system. And that's both measured by both externalities like environments and the quality of the water leaving the amount of water leaving the farm.
I've got a lot of great questions here from the audience, but I've got one more I want to address to Christine before we get into them. Christine, a lot of economists tell me, resource economists in particular, don't worry about all that degradation that's happening. Once the market needs that commodity, a solution will be found. You don't seem to subscribe to that viewpoint. I think that's the dry economist, isn't it?
It's a very dry economist. I didn't get trained at the time I got trained. I went through the 1970s. And in those days, you actually believed that the market can't solve everything, and there are some things that the market just doesn't solve. And these kind of issues are the intractable ones that the market won't ever solve properly.
And so if we expect the market to solve this problem and we don't take action, what's the economic endpoint of that?
Well, a very, very suboptimal outcome.
Suboptimal. Thank you. I think she means people will starve. Okay, so from the audience, our first one. All these predictions we have heard tonight don't take climate change into account. Peter, you've been thinking a lot about this. You didn't explicitly talk about climate change.
I did actually.
You explicitly talked about climate change, and I missed that little bit. But elaborate on how Australia might change as our climate changes and how our agriculture copes with that. It's not all doom and gloom, is it?
No. The impacts of climate change itself and the impacts of climate change on agriculture vary significantly spatially across Australia. Some parts are less likely to be significantly affected than others. Far North Australia, that currently has about a third of our beef herd, isn't likely to have significant changes in the amount or very largely the pattern of rainfall, though the temperature could go up a tad, which may but may not push up evaporation. So there could be an impact there on water use efficiency. The really big impacts seem to be in southeastern Australia and southwest Australia. And it's very clear, for example, in the Western Australia wheat belt, if you look over the last 30 years, there's a very strong negative gradient in the amount of rainfall that falls every winter when the wheat crops are growing. It also now falls about a month later, starts falling about a month later than it did 30 years ago. So the actual opportunity to use the water that falls has reduced as well. So there's going to be different impacts depending on where you are in Australia and what you do. I did explicitly mention that mitigating the impacts of, mitigating climate change, but also adapting to the climate change that does occur will be part of the challenge of meeting growing food demand in future.
Thank you. I'm distracted by having read a question here, which in good Q&A style I'm going to take as a comment. A first-year lecturer once told me that the places in the world with the best land are those that have historically supported large population densities. How is Northern Australia supposed to be a food bowl when it hasn't historically had a large population? And I think that's an extremely good comment, which I think we can largely agree with. Not yet.
As I mentioned, so just to talk about Northern Australia, if we're looking at the northern draining catchments, so that's about 120 million hectares. There's very little cultivated agriculture there at the moment, about 34,000 hectares out of 120 million. We do have a third of Australia's beef herd there. And I did mention as well that there's the potential to have 1.5 million hectares of irrigated ag there. So food bowl, well, look, if you're a carnivore, it's already one. Northern Australia, if it was a country, would be supplying, would be the 7th largest beef exporter in the world. So what's your definition of food bowl? Really, some of that hinges around. There is the capacity, as I mentioned, to increase intensive food production in the north, but there's a lot of impacts to be considered if that were to occur.
Very good. This one perhaps for you, Christine, and then Phil. Where is the leadership in soil knowledge that connects with farmers? And then how high on the political agenda, Commonwealth State, is investing in maintaining soil health for agricultural production? So Christine, the first of those you can comment on happily. The second's going to be a political statement.
It's going to be a political statement, which I will not respond to. The first one in terms of who does the advice, I'm very proud to say that a lot of that soils expertise sits in my area. We have, correctly, I think around about 50 soil scientists working in my area, and then we've got others working out in the agriculture department as well.
So can I ask for a real, the farmer, yep.
The connecting to the farmer is probably where we don't have as good connections as we may have had in the past. Phil's point in terms of free advice is you're never going to get good advice. My dad used to work at Citizens Advice Bureau, and he used to be an executive, and he said, never ever give anyone free advice. They don't value it, and I think that's a very good point. What we have got now is a lot of fact sheets on the internet. So a lot of the information is pushed out that way rather than through extension offices, which is where traditionally that soils information was pushed out. But there's a lot of information out there, and I'd encourage you all to go on our website and have a good look.
And Phil, a quick comment about private enterprise in soils knowledge transfer to farmers.
Luckily, I don't make a living out of providing soil knowledge to the farmers. I have done in the past and still continue to do quite a number of seminar days where I try and teach farmers to be soil aware, where I talk about how much they can do, much the same as I've talked here, is that you don't need soil testing to actually work out whether your productivity of your soil is improving. You can do it yourself. But having said that, I'll throw the question back to you, Neil. How many soil scientists are we training? Because it is a major issue that agricultural science, which is where soil scientists get trained from, is a diminishing student body. And from agricultural science, the hardest discipline line to do is soil science, which makes it even more diminishing. And so the ramification is there is a lot of agronomists out there teaching soils, and they're doing a great job, but the capacity to communicate some of the more complicated issues and bring them down to distill them to their essence for what's applicable to the farm is sometimes lacking. And that's not to do with their education, it's the fact that they are actually agronomists. So if you ask a farmer how often he goes into the paddock to look at his crop during the filling of the head, it would be daily. If you ask a farmer how often he would go amongst his sheep or cattle during lambing or calving, it would be daily. If you ask a farmer how often they inspect their soil, it would have been once every 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 years. So there is a major education role needed, and I'll throw it to you, Neil.
Yes, it's always the university's fault, I know that, Phil. One of the good stories, though, is that there's a recognition amongst our community that agriculture is a growth area. And actually, for the first time in my professional life, I've heard government ministers, even the Prime Minister, speak about soil. So the world is changing. Public awareness results in students at school being interested and joining us to study. So hopefully the future's brighter than the past.
I was just going to add that probably the best advice a farmer will get is from another farmer. Because of the dearth in the lack of field officers and scientists actually being really there with the most innovative farmers, and you can go anywhere, Mexico, particularly around the peasant farming population, we're finding a lot of our farmers are getting the best idea from peasant farmers in Japan, peasant farmers in Mexico, from their own farmers. Now Australia has built up a capacity. I think there's around about 10,000 ecological farmers in Australia now, and that's growing. And they are at the cutting edge because they've taken on board all of this great sort of consultancy that's come forward. They've taken on board all the information that they're getting from other parts of the world. They've sifted it through to what's going to be applicable on their land, whether it's hydration or adding organic matter, and they're doing amazing things. You know, Colin Seiss, just incredible farmers. You know, we have some of the world's leading farmers here in Australia that are teaching other farmers, and that is probably the primary source, backed up by fantastic paid-for research.
There's no question that we have some outstanding farmers in Australia, and that a lot of Australia's solutions to farming problems have been generated not by we scientists but by the farmers that we learnt them off. There's one last question here. We are out of time, but there's one last question that I think's a good one, and we're going to answer it myself. Hey? Why not? How much would Australia be able to produce without petrochemicals, i.e. nitrogen fertiliser? And I'm going to answer that in a rather indirect way and invite you to dine on some munchies. If we look globally, you can do a very simple calculation of how much nitrogen fertiliser we use and how much ends in our food and how much of that ends in our bodies. And so a third of human biomass globally is made by Haber Bosch, so nitrogen fertiliser. If we do the same calculation for Australia, it works out at about a half of the Australian human biomass is made up out of Haber Bosch, so nitrogen fertiliser. So, you know, yeah, let's do without it, but half of you have got to go. I'm not going to go. I kind of like nitrogen fertiliser and the food that it produces for me. But if in each of the rows we can identify 2 to 3 people, we will compost you and return your organic matter to the soil. With that silly endpoint, would you join with me in thanking our panel for an outstanding evening?